Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome to my studio. When people first start painting with watercolors, they tend to concentrate on the paints, the brushes and the paper. I think that's because they're the items that cost all the money. But really, the most important ingredient when painting with watercolors is not that, it's water. Now let me tell you a little story. About 15 years ago, my daughter-in-law, for Christmas, gave me a diary. Now I didn't keep diaries at the time, and still don't, but I wanted to do something special with it. So what I decided to do, because basically it was just full of blank pages numbered from 1 to 365, I thought, why don't I start recording watercolor tips? And that's what I did. And the very first tip is the subject of today's video. In that diary, I basically said the most important ingredient for painting watercolors is water. And you have to understand the characteristics of water to paint good watercolors. So all through this video, I'm going to be giving you tips about why water is so important when you're painting your watercolor paintings. And I hope you join me all the way through to the end. So let's get started. When creating a painting, a key thing to get right is the relative tones of particular parts of your painting. When we talk about tones in our painting, we're talking about the relative lightness and darkness of a particular passage. And to create those tones, we have two things. One, the native tone of the colour itself. For instance, French ultramarine is a darker tone than cad yellow. But in addition to that, a key component of creating tonal variation is the amount of water we add to the mixture. So if we want to create a light tone, we would have lots more water than pigment. And if we want a darker tone, we can add more paint and less water to the mixture. Probably one of the most important uses of water when you're painting. Now, when it comes to getting the tones correct, a common mistake that's made is people look at their paint well and they look at this mixture and say, oh yes, that's a particular tone. But if you were to paint with that on your paper, and a good way to test this is just to lightly press and then drag your brush along. This is the actual tone that you would be creating. Can you see how different this is relative to this tone? An analogy you can use is the water in the ocean. Now, water has a very, very slight blue tint. When you see it in the ocean, where it's many feet or meters deep, it looks quite blue. But if you were to pick up a glass of water, it looks virtually transparent. So the depth of the water of your mixture can be very misleading. So this is another reason why you have to, or you should, test your colors on a scrap piece of paper before transferring that to your paper. What else you need to know about water, which basically seems obvious but people don't always think about it, is that when you wet the paper can absorb quite a great deal of water. And what happens as the paper starts to absorb water, it starts to cockle or undulate, and that can make it a bit more difficult to paint passages in your painting. So one of the things I do, and I have a whole video on this which I will link to in the description below, but basically to get around that cockling, I wet the back of my paper. So this is 90 pound or 185 GSM Arches cold press paper. And you can see I'm sloshing quite a bit of water on this. See how shiny that is. Now I'll leave that there for a few minutes, and normally when I'm painting, while this water is being absorbed in the paper, I spend some time mixing my colours, and then when I've finished mixing my colours I come back and re-wet the back of this paper. But right now we'll just let it sit there and we'll speed the clock up a little bit, and then I can do the next stage. You can see here how the paper is cockling. Now I come back and just wet this again. You can see how it's only cockling a small amount at the moment. It's important to note I'm not wetting the front of the paper. Now I'll take that off and I'll wet my board as well. So there you go. Now you can see the paper sitting nice and flat. Basically, by wetting the back, we effectively force the paper to stretch. That's all cockling is, it's uneven stretching. By thoroughly wetting the back, the paper stretches and sits nice and flat on our board. And also, because I've wet the board and because of the wetness of the paper sits and sticks onto the backing board. By the way, this is just a piece of 6mm or a 1/4 inch thick acrylic, in case you're interested. The other reason I do this is because by thoroughly wetting the back and forcing the paper to absorb all that moisture, when I start painting the front, I can paint for much longer before the top surface dries. I'm just going to mix some colours that you would find in a sunset. We'll start with a violet. Just test it, that'll do. Maybe a bit stronger. That'll do. There we go. So we've just got some colours here that you can use for a sunset. Normally I don't wet the front of my paper, but for this exercise I'm going to, because I want to exaggerate some of the effects that can happen due to the fact that you're painting with water. When I'm painting in the studio, I normally paint with my board at 15 to 20 degrees. I set up my easel at that angle, and then I have a stiff board. In this case it's a 6mm thick piece of acrylic, and my paper is affixed to that. I'll wet that a little bit more. So at this stage, if we look at the surface of the paper, it's very wet and it's very shiny. Well, the shininess is what tells you that it's very wet. If I pick up some of the permanent rose, which is a dye, and because the paper is at an angle, just like a little waterfall, and it's also very wet, the paint is flowing down the paper. If I was to pick up some French ultramarine, which is more particle based, what you'll find is the French ultramarine won't flow as far as the permanent rose. And you can see this if you start with a mixture of both. And over time what you'll find happening is the pink of the permanent rose will separate from the blue of the French ultramarine. We'll just give that a moment. Another way I can speed this up is by lifting the board at a steeper angle, and that will enhance the effect of gravity. And you can see already how much further that's flowed down, and you can see how the pink is separating out from the blue. So a lot of the blue of the French ultramarine, because it's more particle based, a lot of those particles, and you can see it more here, are falling into the little troughs on this cold pressed paper. Whereas with the permanent rose, because it is just a dye, that paint has kept flowing to a greater distance. This is something you have to know about your pigments. How do they interact with water? This is another reason why it's better to have about a dozen colours that you know very well rather than having dozens of colours that you don't understand beyond their basic colour. Right now, this paper is still quite wet, so I can do this. And other than a small amount of staining, I can continue to paint on this surface. Because this is just an exercise, I'm just saving a little bit of money on the paper. When you're painting the sky, you want to preserve your bright colours, and one of the ways you do that is by turning your board around and painting your sky upside down. So we'll start with the brighter colours first. Actually, we'll start with the pink first. And we'll go into the reds. Then we'll go into this violet. Now right now, the transition between the orange and the red is a bit too dramatic. So what I could do for that, we'll pick up some more orange and we'll just paint through that. As long as you keep the shine on the paper, you can do a lot of painting without getting yourself into any difficulty. Now, if you find that these shapes are just looking too regular, another thing you can do is pick up your board and change the angle. And because the surface is still quite wet, see how wet that is? I can now, instead of having a sky where all the colours are just in strips, I can change it and allow those colours to flow in a more angled manner. This is another reason why it's better to have a solid board under your painting rather than placing your paper directly on your easel, which is a lot harder to pick up. Now, I've painted this with a particular consistency of paint. If I wanted to create some clouds, I need some contrast, and the way you do that is you need thicker paint. So I've just added some French ultramarine and permanent rose into the paint I already had there that I used up the top. That immediately tells me this is going to be thicker. I'm going to add a little bit of cad orange just to grey that off a fraction. So because I haven't added any more water to this, I immediately know these clouds are going to appear as a stronger tone in the sky. Let's paint in a big cloud here, maybe some smaller ones in the distance, and intermediate cloud there. If I tried to paint the clouds with the weaker mix, they would not appear quite so obvious. So this is why it's very important to concentrate on your paint consistency. This is the tone I've mixed, and you can see how much darker it is than the paint I used before. This tone is a lot darker than that tone. They'll tend to bleed downwards more than upwards because that's the effect of gravity again, keeping that paint flowing down the paper. So look at the paper, it's still got a reasonable shine, but can you see up here it's lost most of that shine? What can happen again, if this part of the paper dries to the point where it's barely wet and then you go and paint with quite a weak wash, some of that paint will be sucked up and it'll create what we call a cauliflower. So unless you want to do that on purpose, it's best to try and avoid it. Now here, I would prefer these clouds to be a bit more horizontal at the bottom. So one of the ways you can do that is just to turn your paper around like that, and if you want to speed it up, you can just lift the angle of the board like that. So right now it's about 80 degrees. It doesn't matter what angle. Now it's almost 90 degrees to really speed it up. I'll just give it another minute. Now, one of the things you have to watch out for, because I've held it up at this angle, see all the water is beading here, and we'll talk more about a bead in another segment in this video. But because there's all this water there, and the paper is getting at the damp stage, it risks creating a cauliflower in the other direction. So In this case it doesn't really matter because I haven't taped it, so I haven't lost any surface area from my painting. So if it's just a small shape like that, when you frame it, you would frame it over that anyway, so it's not a big problem. So there's our sky. If we want to put in some dark hills, just to turn it into something, we can thicken the paint because the hills will be darker in tone than both the sky and the clouds. Again, you can see how wet the paper is. Every time you go back in and paint something else, like when I painted the clouds, in addition to depositing the pigment, I'm also adding some more water to the paper, and that helps keep the paper wet. Now, as the paper is drying, so if we look at this, see how it's lost that shine, okay, but it's still damp. And if you time it right, with the right paint consistency, so again, so this is even darker toned paint, can you see, if you look at the surface there, how it's literally creating the tree line for us. So again, by being aware of how wet is the paper, what's the paint consistency, with the right timing, you can get it to very quickly help you paint your painting. I didn't particularly mean for this to be an actual painting, but I can't help myself. I'll just throw in the plane down here. Okay, for this exercise, I need to wet the front of the paper, and then as it dries, I want to put an equal amount of paint on the paper. So you can see that as it's drying, how the same amount of paint reacts very differently to the wetness of the paper. And because I want to do this in a fairly short period of time, I haven't bothered wetting the back. If I wet the back, the paper would just take too long to dry. So what I've done is I've mixed quite a strong mix of French ultramarine and permanent rose. That's that mixture there. And I've put it into a little plastic pipette, and I want to just be able to drop one drop at a time when I do this. Just got to make sure it's ready to drop. That should be okay. Okay, so first thing, got a big wet brush, and I'm just going to very quickly wet the surface of the paper. And right now it's very wet. You can see how shiny it is. And if I just drop one drop here, I get the drop ready. It's not coming out as a drop. There we go. Okay, the paper's very wet and it's just running down the paper. Because I'm painting at about 15 or 20 degrees, the top part of the paper will actually be drier than the bottom part. If I tilt this slightly, you can see all this water that's pooling down below. So when you're painting, you have to be mindful of that, and you can use that to help you with your painting. If you create a particular mark here and it has a particular soft edge, you know that if you move down the paper, provided the paper is actually wet in that area, you know if you moved down the paper, you'll get a softer edge because it is just naturally going to be a bit drier up there. Now I'm going to drop another drop here. And what you can see here is it's not flowing anywhere near as much, and to some extent it's also being sucked to the side. That's because this area of the paper is now, it's already lost its shine, or most of its shine, which means that the non-shiny paper is thirstier than the shinier section, and it's trying to suck up some of this moisture into it. Get ready for the next drop. Now, here, it's because the paper is cockled. You can see that. It's obviously not going to flow down straight down the paper, but again, it's slowing down in terms of how it spreads. Now, I'm doing this in real time to show you, as the paper dries, what can happen. Because I've got a lot of water down here, I'm going to just lift that. Just dry the edge a bit. Now, most of the surface of the paper has lost its shine, and the paper is continuing to dry, so let's do one more drop. So here, because the paper has dried quite a bit, it's virtually stopped flowing, or it's flowing very, very minor. Let me see if there's an area that's still a little bit wetter. If we come down the paper a bit, okay, so remember what I said, because the water in the paper has been flowing down through the paper fibers so that it is wetter. It's going to be wetter down below than it is at the top. Up the top here, the paint's not going anywhere, it's just sitting there as a big puddle because the paper around it is dry. But move down a couple of inches and that part of the paper isn't as dry as what is up there, so the paint is still flowing. So this is why when you're painting you have to be very observant as to how wet is your paper surface. The thickness of your paint is also important, but the wetness of the surface is absolutely critical if you want to create soft edges or hard edges at will. So keep that in mind. In this demonstration, I'm going to be explaining what the bead is when we talk about doing a watercolor wash. The bead is the shiny line of liquid paint that forms at the bottom of a wash when you're painting on dry paper. Let me mix some colors because this is something that's a lot easier to show than explain. This is a very simple landscape. Let me mix some colors. I'll start with a very simple blue sky wash. So I'll just mix some cobalt blue. That'll do. And a little bit of raw umber for the ground. This is really just a very quick demonstration. First step is to pick up a brush with lots of paint in it. This is what I call a fully loaded brush. A fully loaded brush is one where if you tip the brush with the point facing down, some paint actually drips out of it. And already you can see the bead. So what the bead is the paint as it flows down your paper. Obviously your paper has to be inclined for that to happen. And then when you paint the next wash, or the next line of the wash, you paint into that. And if you do it fast enough, I'm going to lighten this now by dipping my brush in water. So each successive brush stroke touches that bead. I usually like to paint into it about 1/4 of an inch. And then you can drag that bead around as you bring that paint down the paper. So you're just using that bead to help you move the paint around your objects. In a landscape like this, I quite often will just leave that bead sitting there, and that just gives the paint time to stay in the paper. The top part of the bead will mostly be clean water as the paint settles to the bottom. Alright, so now I'm going to paint the ground. When I paint this next wash, I run it along there. Paint around there, I'll paint around the cow. So what's happened, that bead has mixed with some of this ground colour, and the extra water in it has lightened it. And that's important because when you're painting a landscape, the grass in the distance will be lighter in tone than the grass in the foreground. And also some of that blue that was still in the water has mixed with that initial wash of the ground colour, and that's also useful for adding depth to your painting because objects in the distance will be a little bit bluer than the objects in the foreground. So the grass in the distance, we make it just a little bit bluer than the grass in the foreground, and that allows us to add more depth to our landscape. I usually exaggerate these effects to create paintings that have a lot more depth in them. Then we'll just run that down. And now, because I'm nearly at the end of the paper, I'm painting quite quickly and not worrying too much about that bead. While this is drying, I will just add some splatter to the foreground. Just some raw umber and cobalt turquoise will do. Now I'll add some burnt sienna, a little bit of French ultramarine and some raw umber just to create a warmer and thicker mix. And you can see now how the thicker paint doesn't flow as much as the more watery greeny colour. Now, in addition to the darker splatter, you can also get clean water and splatter with some of that. And that will give this area a different feel to it as the water flows down and mixes with some of these other colours that are already on the paper. You can even drizzle some water straight out of the brush. Just going to mix a dull grey green colour. That's okay. This is really just an exercise painting. I'll add a little bit more paint to this to make it just a bit stronger in tone. So now if we look at the painting, you can see how it's got areas where it's lost its shine and then other areas where there's just a hint of a shine there. What I can do at this stage is I get a credit card or a piece of a plastic card and I cut some of the corners so that I don't want to use the really sharp edge, and I can use that to scrape in, say, some fence posts. Very big fence post by the look of that one. So what happens here is wherever the paper is reasonably dry, you end up with a white line. In areas where it's still quite wet, you get a darker line because some of the paint around the line flows into the line and darkens it. And then you get others that are in between where you get some dark and some light, which helps create a more interesting painting. I can also just hint at some sort of fence line. Just paint our cow. do. I'll just mix a little shadow colour, just some French ultramarine, permanent rose and a tiny bit of burnt sienna. And then the shed. Give it some rust. I usually use some permanent rose. You can also use alizarin crimson instead of that. And then a warmer red like Scarlet Lake in my case. Cad red would work as well. And I add a little bit of burnt sienna to it just to dull it off. I'm going to mix a dull grey colour. And we'll paint the windows. The water tank. And it will have a little shadow. Some of these posts would have a shadow as well. Really just a very quick demonstration. I'm just going to dry this very quickly and I'll just put the last little shadows in and adjust the rust. I'll throw in some sharper edges, little broken edges for the rusty roof. And the same here. And we'll throw in a few grasses in the foreground. Some smaller grasses in the distance. I mainly use the bead when painting big washes. In small shapes you can also use it sometimes, but generally I paint so fast that the bead doesn't even have time to form in these smaller shapes. In this demonstration I'm going to show you 3 additional techniques. One is how to lift wet paint from your painting with a thirsty brush. Another is how to soften a hard edge with a damp brush. And the third is how to use salt to create texture on a surface. So let's begin. As a subject, we're just going to use 2 rocks. And I'll mix some French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I've taken about 3/4 of the water out of the brush, and then you just run that along the edge of your paint. That will soften that edge. Just change that a little bit, and then you can clean your brush. Squeeze all the water out. So now you can tell there's hardly any water on the brush because it's not bouncing back to a point, and you can use that to lift the paint. So basically the brush just acts like a sponge and lifts some of the water and paint off the surface of your paper. We'll extend some of this paint down and turn that into a bit of a shadow, which will just help connect the rock to the ground. Now, At this stage, there's still quite a lot of shine on the surface of that rock. If I was to drop the salt in it, especially in the wet area, the salt would melt. So we have to wait till it just loses its shine. And it's a bit of a, I was about to say it's a bit of an art. It takes a bit of practice to know exactly when to drop the salt in. We'll just wait until the shine leaves the rock, and then we'll drop in the salt. If you go in too early, the salt will melt and not create the effect you're after. So it's all about timing. All right, so if we have a look at this, it's lost a good bit of the shine up here. If it goes too dry, the salt won't work. This is a good time to hit the surface of your paint with some salt to create the effect we're after. Down here it's very wet, so we won't get much of a reaction, but what I'm going to do down here is use a bigger salt crystal so that it doesn't get a chance to dissolve, and hopefully we'll get some interesting effects down here as well. You don't need a lot of salt, and you don't drop it from a great height or it'll just bounce everywhere. So I'm going to drop some of that salt there. And I've got a few bigger salt crystals which I'll just place in this wetter area. Anyway, it's something you experiment on and have fun with. Now we have to leave that until it dries. You can see here how the smaller salt crystals are starting to create this textured effect. What's actually happening on the surface of the paper is the salt crystals are absorbing the water and dragging some of that paint along with them, which is why it's leaving the white area of paper. Anyway, we'll wait a little bit longer. This is mostly dry. I'm going to hit it with a hairdryer now. The main thing is you get the idea of the sort of thing you can create with this. When it's dry, you can just scrape the salt off your painting. The big salt crystals didn't do very much. They just had more of a flat shape like that. Partly that's because I didn't let it dry completely before hitting it with a hairdryer. Hopefully this has given you some ideas as to where you can use this technique in your paintings. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me out a lot. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.